When we hear the word witch today, we think of empowerment, maybe a little bit of spooky fun, and nature. But the real history behind that word, well, it's a story of terror, torture, and full blown mass hysteria. So let's peel back the layers of this really dark chapter of our past and see what it can teach us about our present. So, first things first, we've got to get our heads around just how different our idea of a witch is from the historical one. It's like night and day. On one hand, you have the 21st century witch. That's a figure tied to spiritual practices, empowerment, even social media trends like witch talk. But on the other hand, the 17th century witch, that was something else entirely. We're talking about a literal agent of the devil, a criminal whose supposed crimes were seen as an attack on God and society itself. And this modern reimagining it's everywhere. You see it in popular TV shows, the rise of neo-paganism, the whole aesthetic is booming. In Scotland, they've even created an official tartan to memorialize the historical victims. It's a powerful symbol of remembrance and, in a way, reclamation.
Okay, but let's hit pause on the modern aesthetic for a minute, because to really understand this history, we have to face the brutal, shocking reality of what the witch hunts actually were. This was not about pointy hats and broomsticks. This was about fear, accusation, and state-sanctioned murder. The scale of it is just staggering. Across Europe, over a span of several centuries, historians estimate that as many as 60,000 people were executed for the crime of witchcraft. Think about that. These weren't just a few isolated incidents. This was a continent-wide phenomenon.
And the path to that execution? It was paved with just unimaginable cruelty. And what's truly shocking is that in many places, like Scotland, torture was technically illegal without special permission from the government. But as you can see, that didn't stop them. Brutal methods like thumbscrews, iron muzzles, and days upon days of sleep deprivation were used all the time to break a person's will and force a confession.
So, how on earth did this happen? How did entire societies descend into this kind of madness? Well, it wasn't random. It was what some historians call a perfect storm of political, religious, and social anxieties that created this desperate need for someone to blame. And you can see how this storm had been brewing for a long, long time. It started with books like the Malleus Maleficarum, which was basically a how-to guide for witch hunters. Then came the laws, like Scotland's Witchcraft Act, which made it a crime punishable by death. And this is crucial. You had royal endorsement. King James VI of Scotland was obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with witches. He even wrote his own book, Daemonology. And after he survived the gunpowder plot, his fear of secret conspiracies just went into overdrive. And all that paranoia from the top trickled down into a society that was already on a knife's edge. Communities were strained by war, they were being torn apart by religious conflict between Protestants and Catholics, and they were terrified by economic disasters like famine. When your crops fail or a sickness spreads, it's easier to blame your neighbor than to accept that bad things just happen. The vulnerable became the perfect scapegoats.
So, the stage is set. Now let's get into the terrifying mechanics of the process itself. How did a simple accusation, something maybe born out of a petty grudge, spiral into a public execution? Well, it was system, and it was horrifyingly efficient. It all started with an accusation. Then came interrogation, where getting a confession was the only thing that mattered. Proof was just manufactured. Officials would literally prick an accused person's body with needles, looking for a devil's mark where they supposedly couldn't feel pain. The trial itself was a total sham, accepting all kinds of ridiculous testimony. And finally, execution. Usually the accused was strangled to death, and then their body was burned, this final, brutal act to make sure the devil couldn't get them back. And speaking of unbelievable testimony, let's talk about one of the most bizarre forms of proof that was allowed in court, something called spectral evidence. Okay, so this meant a witness could get up and testify that the accused person's spirit attacked them, maybe in a dream or a vision. It was by definition completely unverifiable. I mean, think about it. How do you prove your ghost wasn't somewhere?
And if you think that sounds crazy in theory, just listen to this. This is a real quote from the Pendle Witch trial in 1612. A 9-year-old girl, Janet Device, testified against her own mother. Her spectral evidence of a talking spirit dog helped send her entire family, including her mom, to the gallows. It's just chilling.
So who were these people being accused? The picture we all have in our heads is usually the lonely, elderly outcast, the so-called crone on the edge of the village. But the actual data, it tells a totally different story. Look at this chart from Scotland. A whopping 77% of accused women were married. Another 21% were widowed. These weren't outsiders. These were members of the community. They were wives, mothers, neighbors. And that tells us something really important. The hunts weren't about rooting out the isolated, but about tensions that were simmering right in the heart of the community.
The witch hunts did, eventually, fade away. But their shadow is long. The unbelievable injustice of these trials forced a legal reckoning that actually shaped the very foundations of our modern justice systems, and it gave us a chilling lesson in human psychology. I mean, the sheer injustice forced a complete legal revolution. Out of these horrific trials came ideas we now totally take for granted: the presumption of innocence, the need for real, actual evidence, and the right to remain silent. These fundamental rights were born directly from the ashes of those execution pyres.
And what about the social legacy? The author Margaret Atwood, I think, just put it perfectly. The witch hunts aren't just some dusty historical event. They're a timeless warning. They represent a pattern of human behavior that can pop up whenever a society is put under extreme pressure.
So ultimately, what's the big takeaway here? The Great Witch Hunts are so much more than a history lesson. They're a powerful and frankly scary reminder of a dark human tendency. When we are afraid of war, of disease, of economic collapse, we look for someone to blame. And all too often, that blame falls on those with the least amount of power. Which leaves us with one final and pretty unsettling question to think about. The specific fear of witches might be gone, but that instinct to scapegoat is not. This history forces us to ask, when our society feels the pressure today, who do we point our fingers at?